The flowers were always fresh. That was the first thing the man noticed, that the small bunch of wildflowers on the unmarked stone at the back of the cemetery never had time to wilt before another took its place. He'd been visiting the grave beside it for 3 weeks, and every morning the flowers were new. On the 4th Monday, he finally saw her, a girl no older than 9, kneeling in the wet grass at dawn, laying down a fresh handful and whispering something he couldn't hear. The stone had no name, just a worn brass plate that read K9, faithful unto death. The man stood very still by the next row of graves and said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that the first thing you do is watch. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay until the very end. What you're about to hear will restore your faith in the people who are still out there, quietly paying attention. Let's see how far this journey takes us together. His name was Logan Hayes, and he was 42 years old, built lean and hard through the shoulders the way men stay built when the habit outlives the reason for it. His dark hair had gone gray at the temples, cropped close. A faded scar crossed the back of one hand and disappeared into his sleeve, the kind of mark a man stops explaining after the 10th time someone asks. But it was the eyes people noticed and then looked away from. Pale steel blue that seemed to measure exits, hands, voices, and grief without asking permission. And then, having measured, let you be. He moved through the world with the permanent stillness of a man who had nothing left to prove. Not aggression, its opposite. He was not unfriendly by nature. Life had simply sanded down the parts of him that used to speak first. He watched more than he talked, and when he finally did move, he moved all at once, the way still water becomes a flood. Kandahar had taken friends. The years after had taken the illusion that peace meant quiet. Now Logan lived in the narrow space between discipline and distance, in a small Oregon town where nobody knew his name, which was exactly how he'd wanted it. Logan had served 14 years in the Navy, the last 9 as a SEAL with 3 deployments, 2 to Helmand and 1 to Kandahar that he didn't talk about. He'd left after a compound assault put 2 of his men in the ground and enough metal in his shoulder that the surgeon spent 6 hours deciding what to leave. The discharge had come with a folded flag for another man's wife and a stiffness that woke him on cold mornings. He had carried more men than he could comfortably count, and he had come home to a country that thanked him in airports and forgot him on every road in between. What he carried was simple and heavy. The grave he visited each morning belonged to the last dog he'd handled overseas, a Belgian Malinois named Bravo, who died in his arms on a rooftop, and whose remains he'd spent 2 years and every favor he had left fighting to bring home and bury on American soil. Logan had buried men, but it was the dog he came to see at dawn, because the dog had asked for nothing and given everything, and Logan had never figured out how to stop owing him. The German shepherd who rode in Logan's truck and waited by the cemetery gate was named Shadow. He was 6 years old, 90 pounds of black and rich amber, his coat darkened along the spine and across both ears, his body built like something assembled for a single purpose. His right ear carried a clean notch where shrapnel had passed through it on a road outside Sangan, an inch from ending him. He moved with the clean, controlled confidence of a trained canine who had long ago learned the difference between noise and threat. And he wasted nothing. No motion, no sound, no attention that wasn't earned. Shadow had come to Logan after Bravo, a transfer dog no one else could settle. Logan had spent 8 months fighting the bureaucracy to keep him after the discharge, filing the same forms over and over until someone signed off just to be rid of him. Shadow had never left his side since. He was routine, warning system, witness, and in the lonelier corners of the last few years, the closest thing Logan had let himself call family. And this morning, watching the kneeling girl through the iron fence, Shadow was not growling. He was leaning toward her, the soft, urgent pull he made when something out there needed help. The town was called Cedar Falls, tucked into the green, wet edge of the Oregon Coast Range, where the firs stood black against a pale sky, and the fog rolled down off the ridge and pooled in the low ground. The cemetery sat at the end of a gravel lane, the oldest part of town, where the grass grew long between the stones and the air smelled of rain and cedar, and the particular silence that doesn't exist anywhere but among the dead. At dawn, the cold came up off the wet ground, and a person's breath hung in it. It was a place people came to and left quickly. A child who came every single day, alone, before school, was not something the few morning visitors knew what to do with. So they did what people do. They looked away and kept walking. The man who owned the cemetery and the funeral home attached to it and a good deal else in Cedar Falls was named Harlan Vance. His family had run the only mortuary in 3 counties for 60 years, and the Vance name sat on the bank's board, the cemetery's iron gate, and a brass plaque in the town hall. Harlan had a way of making complaints disappear and inspections come back clean. People in Cedar Falls were polite to him and said nothing real when he passed. He'd learned early that consequences were for other people, and 50 years had taught him nothing to the contrary. What people knew about Harlan Vance was that he doubled the price of plots the year the mill closed and families had the least to give. What they knew was that the groundskeeper who'd questioned where the perpetual care money went had been fired and run out of town. What they knew was that you did not cross Harlan Vance, and so when something seemed wrong at the cemetery, they kept it to themselves. The girl was 9, small for it, with serious dark eyes and a way of holding her chin level that did not match the rest of her. Her name was Emma. Her grandfather had been a K9 handler in Vietnam, and the unmarked stone at the back of the cemetery belonged to his dog, a war dog named Duke, who'd come home with him decades ago and been buried here, in the cheap back row, because that was all the family could afford. Her grandfather had visited that grave every morning of his life. He had died in the spring, and Emma, 9 years old, had simply taken up the thing he could no longer do, because someone had to, and because she had promised him she would. She did not cry where people could see. She had learned that the truth made adults uncomfortable, and uncomfortable adults went away. She carried herself with dignity first. She picked the wildflowers from the ditch along the gravel lane so they'd be fresh. She arranged them carefully. She had kept the promise alone for 2 months and told no one, because the one adult who would have understood was the one lying 3 rows over. Logan watched her finish, press her small hand flat to the cold brass plate for a moment, like her grandfather must have done, and stand to go. And then he saw something else. A fresh stake driven into the ground beside the unmarked stone, and a printed notice zip-tied to it. He waited until the girl had walked out the gate, and then he crossed the wet grass and read it. It was a notice of disinterment and plot reclamation, dated 4 days out. Harlan Vance's funeral home letterhead at the top. The back row was being cleared for premium replatting. Unmarked and unpaid graves first, including the dog's. Logan went very quiet, the way he used to go quiet right before everything happened at once. He came back the next morning, and this time he was there before her. And when she knelt, he crouched a respectful distance off and spoke low, so as not to startle her. "Morning," Logan said. Just that. Emma went still, ready to bolt. "Those are good flowers," he said. "Whoever's under there is lucky somebody remembers." He nodded at the brass plate. What's his name? The dog? Duke. Her chin came up. He was my grandpa's, in the war. Grandpa came every day, and now I do because I promised. Shadow had come through the gate behind Logan, off-leash. And now he walked past the man and lay down in the wet grass beside Emma, uninvited. His big body curved toward her and put his head down near the brass plate as if he understood exactly what it marked. Emma's careful composure cracked, just slightly, and she put one small hand on the dog's notched ear. Harlan Vance did not back down, because men like Harlan Vance never back down from something they believe they own. Over the days that followed, Logan learned the shape of it. He learned the disinterment notice wasn't really about replatting at all. He learned the back rows held dozens of perpetual care graves. Graves families had paid Vance's company to maintain forever, and that the Perpetual Care Trust Fund, which by law could never be touched, had been quietly drained over 15 years to cover Harlan's debts. Clearing the graves and reselling the plots was how he meant to cover the hole before the state ever looked. Duke's grave, unpaid and unmarked, was simply first because no one would fight for a dog. The ally arrived in the form of the runoff groundskeeper's daughter, a woman named Carol Briggs, who still lived in town and had heard a seal was asking questions at the cemetery. "You're the one looking into Harlan Vance," she said. It wasn't a question. Her father had kept copies of the trust ledgers the year before Vance fired him, proof the perpetual care money was gone. She'd been sitting on it for years, because Vance sat on the same county board as the people meant to investigate him. She gave Logan a name, a state attorney general's consumer protection contact, and an honest county detective named Walsh, who didn't owe the Vance family a thing. Shadow felt the temperature of it before Logan named it. When they neared the funeral home now, the dog sat rigid in the truck, eyes fixed on the doors. And each dawn at the back row, Shadow lay down across the foot of Duke's grave beside Emma, a quiet guard over a stone with no name, and would not be called off until Logan said his name in a particular tone. Logan let him stay. For the first time since her grandfather died, Emma knelt at the grave and was not entirely alone. Logan made the call to Detective Walsh that night and laid it out flat. The drained Perpetual Care Trust, the disinterment notices timed to hide it, the fired groundskeeper, the ledgers. He didn't raise his voice. He'd been trained to brief command, and he briefed it. "You've done this before," Walsh said. "Seen enough of it," Logan said. Harlan Vance moved first, the way the powerful always do when they feel the ground shift. He moved the disinterment up. A backhoe was scheduled for the back row at first light on a Saturday, 2 full days early, to clear the unmarked graves before anyone could file an objection. Duke Stone was first on the work order, and Vance scheduled it for a dawn he assumed no one would witness, least of all a child who should have been home asleep. He had not counted on the girl keeping her promise every single morning, weekend or not. Emma came at dawn, as she always did, and found the backhoe idling beside her grandfather's dog's grave, and a worker with the work order in his hand. And she understood, with the terrible clarity such children have, that the promise she'd made was about to be dug out of the ground in front of her, and that no one was coming. She did not cry. She walked to the unmarked stone, knelt down in front of it, between the brass plate and the machine, and would not move. The worker called for her to get back. She didn't. And then a dusty truck came up the gravel lane fast, 2 days ahead of anything Harlan Vance had planned for, because 14 years of habit and 1 sleepless night had told a man named Logan Hayes to be at that grave before the girl was. Shadow was out of the truck before it stopped. He crossed the wet grass in a dead silent line and lay down flat across the foot of the grave, beside the kneeling girl, directly in the path of the machine. 90 pounds of decision, his amber eyes fixed on the men with the steady, terrible patience of an animal that had stood watch in a war and knew exactly what was worth guarding. He did not bark. He did not lunge. He simply would not let them pass. Harlan Vance arrived minutes later in a long gray coat, and Logan walked to meet him across the long grass, and nobody moved. "Call it off," Logan said. Vance's face was already rearranging into outrage. "This is private property. That grave is unpaid and legally abandoned, and you are trespassing with a dangerous animal. I will have you and that mutt removed. Do you have any idea who I am in this county?" "Senior Chief Petty Officer Logan Hayes," Logan said. "United States Navy, 14 years, 3 deployments. 9 of those years, I had exactly one job. Standing between people who couldn't protect themselves and whatever wanted to hurt them." He stopped a few feet away. "So no, I don't much care who you are in this county. You're trespassing. Detective Walsh is 20 minutes out with a consumer protection investigator from the State Attorney General's office," Logan said, in the same flat, unhurried voice. "They've got 15 years of perpetual care trust records. They've got the ledgers your old groundskeeper kept before you ran him off. They know the trust is empty, and they know these disinterment notices are how you meant to hide it." He let that settle into the cold morning air. "And you scheduled a backhoe to dig up a war dog's grave at dawn, so a 9-year-old keeping a promise to her dead grandfather would be the only witness. You get one chance. Call it off." Vance's voice climbed. "You can't prove a thing. My family built this town. I'll have your truck, your name, and that animal destroyed by the end of the—" "This isn't over," Vance tried, but the words came out smaller than the ones before them. It was over. He just hadn't caught up to it yet. The county vehicles came up the gravel lane in a line, headlights cutting the fog, and Detective Walsh got out unhurried with 2 others. And the look on his face was the look of a man who'd been waiting a long time for a legal reason. The state investigator went to the backhoe and ordered the work order voided on the spot. The detective read Harlan Vance his rights at the edge of the back row, in front of the work crew and 2 early visitors and Carol Briggs, who had come to watch. The quiet town that had looked away for years, now seeing every second of it. A woman among the stones covered her mouth with her hand. Nobody spoke for a long time after that. Logan didn't watch the arrest. He'd crouched in the wet grass beside Emma, where she knelt with one hand on Shadow's notched ear and the other flat against the cold brass plate that read, "Faithful unto death." Emma looked up at him, and the composure she'd held for 2 months trembled at last, just once, before she set her chin level again. "They were really going to dig up Duke," she said. "Nobody else even stopped." Logan looked at the dog lying guard over the unmarked stone, and then at the girl. "He stopped," Logan said, resting a hand on Shadow's back. "First one here. Every morning, same as you. Some of us just can't walk past a promise." 8 months later, the late spring sun came down warm and golden over the back row of the Cedar Falls Cemetery, where someone had finally cut the long grass and the air smelled of cedar and cut clover. Carol Briggs stood by the lane, and Logan stood at the foot of the grave with a girl beside him. And neither of them said much, because they didn't need to. Where the worn brass plate had been, there was now a proper granite headstone, paid for and set straight, carved with a name and 2 dates and the words, "Duke, War Dog, faithful unto death, brought home and never forgotten." Beside Emma, a black and amber German shepherd lay in the warm grass with his head on his paws and his tail moving slow and easy across the ground. The state had frozen Vance's assets and forced the Perpetual Care Trust to be restored from what was recovered. The back row graves were safe, every one of them remarked and tended. Emma still came most mornings before school. But she didn't come alone anymore. Her grandmother came with her now. The two of them tending Duke's grave and her grandfather's together. The promise shared at last, instead of carried by one small girl. Harlan Vance had been convicted of embezzlement and fraud after the audit documented just over $3 million drained from the Perpetual Care Trust across 15 years. He'd been sentenced to 11 years and full restitution, and the Vance name had come quietly off the cemetery's iron gate that spring. The fired groundskeeper's family had been made whole. The town, people said, breathed easier once no one had a reason to be afraid. Logan still came at dawn to the grave beside Duke's, where his own war dog Bravo lay, but he didn't come only to grieve anymore. On the first Saturday of every month, he brought Shadow, and Emma and her grandmother would already be there. And the four of them tended 3 graves together in the early light. And a man who had spent years not knowing what he was for found he had finally, quietly, worked it out. Shadow walked the rows of that cemetery like he belonged to it, lying down at the foot of Duke's stone of his own accord, his tail moving slow against the grass. Peace had arrived. The story was over. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder from the sky. Sometimes they kneel in the wet grass at dawn in the shape of a 9-year-old, keeping a promise no one asked her to keep. And sometimes they come on 4 legs and lie down across a grave that the world had decided was worth nothing. The world isn't saved by superheroes. It's saved by ordinary people who notice the ones everyone else has decided not to see. And by the kind of loyalty, in a child, in a dog, that human language has never been quite able to hold. God does not always raise the dead or undo the years, but he places the right people, and sometimes the right dogs, in exactly the right place at the exact moment a promise is about to be broken. Emma left flowers at a grave with no name because she had promised an old man she would, and she believed she was the only one left who cared. She was almost right. The miracle wasn't that someone powerful saved that grave. It was that a little girl refused to forget. A dog refused to leave, and a man refused to walk past either of them. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that loyalty still lives, even in the quietest places. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And tell us, have you ever kept a promise to someone you lost? Or watched a child carry a weight far heavier than their years? Your story may be the one that reminds another person to stop and look closer. And if you believe in stories of service, loyalty, and the quiet courage of ordinary people, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your home, and keep the memory of every faithful one, on 2 legs and on 4, who was brought home and never forgotten.